This is the first of 6 brief videos on practical theology, walking through primary assumptions and steps with some illustrations. First of all, it's important to realize that practical theology, as we're talking about it, has a core purpose or telos, and that is discerning and joining God's initiatives. There are a lot of other definitions of practical theology that are active and important in both church and academy, but this is the primary purpose and telos that we'll be using, and you'll see why that's important as we work through assumptions and the kind of steps we take. Across the top, you see a number of theological assumptions, and each one of these is key because each one shapes our understanding, shapes our definitions, shapes our activities. First of all is that of God's agency. God is a primary actor. God as Trinity is present and initiating all the time in our own lives and in the lives of our neighbors and the world around us. And that assumption is important because if we have other assumptions that God is not alive or God is coming in behind us after we initiate things, then it changes all of these activities. So God is the primary actor. God is the primary agent is critical for this understanding of practical theology. The second assumption has to do with humans being subjects. And you think of the alternative of humans as objects. When we do strategic planning, when we reduce people to numbers, when we reduce people to needy objects in our neighborhood, we are not working within a Christian understanding of anthropology. That humans are subjects, that means that they have will, that they've been created by God to be creative, to act, and that means we can't just treat them as someone needy to whom we have something that we give them. But all humans are subjects in the church, among leaders, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and it's a critical theological assumption. Thirdly, concerning church, that the church is a discerning and participating community. So you'll see why that lands practical theology as a church activity, not just an activity for experts. So the church is discerning what it is that God is doing in order to be able to join. And the church, as well as those neighbors, are all understood to be active subjects in the whole activity, practice, believing pattern that we're talking about. There's 5 steps in this approach to practical theology. We're going to work through those with each of the subsequent videos. All I'll do here is give some brief definitions of each one. First of all, the current praxis. There's something going on in your church. We're going to look at some particular aspect of it. So the current praxis means that there's a set of practices and theological assumptions or beliefs that are active and present, and that's where we begin practical theology. And as we look at that praxis, we're going to use resources of our culture, resources of our context, both to see more deeply and to analyze what's going on, to understand what caused it, but also to use resources of the culture and context to shape a new imagination, to shape alternative practices. We also are going to draw on our faith traditions and texts and practices. All of Scripture is primary in this form of practical theology, but also the ways in the churches develop practices and beliefs through the centuries. And so we'll be looking at those, and then we look at our praxis and we get an interaction going between the current praxis and those beliefs and practices. We'll see that some of those beliefs are assumed but aren't in operation. And so that will be one of the key aspects of what we're trying to do as we work through the system. The stories of the people who are in the church as well as in the community are critical. We need real narratives, real accounts of how people are experiencing life in this particular praxis that we're investigating. And this all leads to imagination and experiments. How do we discern? What discernment practices would help the church as it shapes a different way of seeing concerning that theme? And then some experiments, some initial, not large, but small experiments that can continue our learning. Notice that in the cycle, while we talk through these 5 steps, any one of them can be a starting point. So God may trigger us by a particular story or by a particular Bible text or by an experience in the culture. So there's a number of starting points. And then there's a number of sequencing, and that's what the leaders and the people need to decide, is what sequence are you going to use. And notice all the variations. It can work across, it can be iterative, you can go back and forth, as long as all of these elements are present. Practical theology works in a constant state of action and reflection, back and forth between action and reflection. And notice across the top are the main action. We go from a current praxis to a next praxis, to a subsequent praxis as a result of the reflection that goes on, the reflection fed by culture and context, by theology and scripture, and by our stories. So action and reflection in some ways shows us what's going on in the whole diagram, but also action and reflection can happen inside any one of these steps as we take an action to learn more and then reflect on it. This is all about, as Clement Sedmak says, waking up. How do we see things we haven't seen before? And you need to be a part of a group that wants to do that rather than one that wants to stay stuck. And that also means that our assumptions are constantly being checked. We need to assume our theology needs some investigation. Our practices need investigation. And so we're waking up and having challenges to our assumptions, and that's perpetual in practical theology, which is why it is so enlivening, why it moves the imagination, why it creates hope. Some of the references we are using throughout the series, a book that I wrote with Juan Martinez, another with Al Roxborough, but you also notice some reflections here from Paulo Freire and Clement Sedmak. In the second video, we'll be looking explicitly at that step number 1, at how we shape, name current praxis, and how we then create a team to move through practical theology.